Will Ashford had everything until grief taught him what silence truly feels like. Ellie Monroe had nothing to prove, and yet she saw everything he tried to hide. Will was 45, successful, respected, and alone by choice. After losing his wife, he locked the world out with quiet mornings, late nights at work, and a heart he refused to feel again. Ellie was 34, thoughtful, steady, never one to chase attention, just a temp assistant in his office. Until one quiet afternoon, she opened a door and unknowingly walked into the most fragile part of his life. Not all heartbreaks come with noise. Some come in soft footsteps and are healed by someone who simply chooses to stay. If you had built walls to survive, would you dare let someone in again? This is a story about the slow, unexpected return of love. A man who stopped believing he deserved it, and a woman who never asked for anything except to be seen. If it touches something in your heart, please like, comment, or subscribe. Your presence here matters. Now, come hear how everything changed when a millionaire CEO walked in on his secretary and found something he never expected. Will Ashford hadn't stepped into the old music room in over 6 years. But that day, something or someone was waiting inside, playing her song. He hadn't planned on returning early that Friday. His afternoon had been cleared due to a last-minute investor cancellation, and instead of taking the extra time to review proposals or catch up on pending reports, things he normally welcomed, he'd found himself walking the halls of the Ashford & Sons headquarters like a man searching for something he couldn't name. The old estate, now converted into company offices, still creaked and breathed like a home. Every floorboard and brass handle held memories from generations past. Will had grown up in these walls, once chasing his brother through the corridors, once holding Claire's hand as she laughed down the grand staircase. Now it was just him and the hush that followed him like a shadow. As he rounded the corner near the west wing, something unfamiliar reached his ears. Piano, soft, deliberate, hesitant at first, like someone rediscovering a forgotten language. He stopped mid-step. The sound was coming from behind a door he hadn't touched in years. The music room. His heart thudded. The door, usually locked, stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open with slow fingers. The room looked just as it had the last time Claire played there. The tall windows spilled golden afternoon light across the worn rug. Dust floated like confetti in the air. The grand piano, once hers, stood in its place, silent for so long. It had become furniture more than instrument. But today, it sang again. Sitting at the bench was a woman slender, back straight, fingers poised in motion. Her long brown hair was pulled into a loose twist. She wore no headphones, no sheet music before her. She played Claire de Lune by heart. Will didn't speak. He could have cleared his throat, made his presence known, but something about the moment felt fragile like glass, and he didn't want to shatter it. The notes danced with memory. Claire had loved that piece. She used to say it made time slow down. She'd play it when storms rolled in, or when she needed to cry but didn't want to explain why. And now, a stranger's hands were bringing it back to life. The final notes lingered, long and slow, before drifting into stillness. Ellie turned her head slightly, sensing she wasn't alone. When she saw him standing there, arms crossed, jaw tight, her eyes widened. I didn't know anyone was here, she said, standing quickly. I'm so sorry. Mr. Ashford. The door was open. I wasn't trying to. I didn't know this room was personal. Her voice wasn't panicked, just quietly sincere. Will said nothing at first. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a click. The silence that followed was thick, but not cold. "I thought no one used this piano," she added softly. "It looked lonely." He approached slowly, his eyes on the instrument, not her. It was my wife's. Ellie's expression shifted not to pity, but to something gentler. Recognition. Maybe. I didn't mean to disrespect her memory. "You didn't," he said. Then after a moment, "You play well." A flicker of surprise passed over her features. "Thank you. My mom was a music teacher. I grew up with a keyboard in every room. But after she passed, I stopped. Until today." He nodded slowly, then moved to the window. From there, he could see the tops of the old magnolia trees swaying in the breeze. Their leaves were starting to fall, blanketing the ground in soft gold and brown. Claire used to love this time of year. The room behind him remained still. "I'll leave you to it," Ellie said after a pause, her voice barely above a whisper. She began to walk toward the door, her steps quiet across the wooden floor. As she passed him, he caught the faint scent of lavender and something else, maybe old books or cedarwood. He didn't stop her. But as the door closed gently behind her, Will found himself standing in a room he'd kept closed for too long. He sat at the piano, not to play, just to sit. The bench groaned softly under his weight, like greeting an old friend. He traced the edge of the keys with his fingers, letting them hover above the notes, but he didn't press. He wasn't ready for that. Instead, he let the music Ellie had played echo in his memory. Not perfect, not polished, but full of quiet reverence, of care. Something inside him stirred, not pain, exactly, but something adjacent to it, a softer ache, a warmth wrapped in loss. For the first time in years, he didn't push it away. He stayed there until the sun dipped low and the room filled with long shadows and silence once more. But this time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like the space after a whisper waiting for the next breath. In the days that followed, Will couldn't explain why the music lingered, but Ellie Monroe had stepped into the one room he had buried and left the door open. People often mistake quietness for emptiness, but some silences are full of meaning if you know how to listen. Monday came with the kind of stillness only a southern fall morning could bring. The oak trees surrounding Ashford and Sons swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves cascading like slow confetti across the cobblestone driveway. Inside the grand old building, work resumed as usual. Printers hummed, phones rang in low bursts, and heels clicked down the long hallways. Ellie Monroe arrived early, as she always did. She didn't mention the piano room, not to the receptionist who offered her coffee, not to the project manager who handed her a stack of schedules. She moved through her tasks with the quiet focus of someone who had long since learned the value of presence over attention. There was no need to speak about what had happened. In her mind, it had been a trespass unintentional. Yes, but still a crossing into something private. She didn't expect forgiveness. She certainly didn't expect curiosity. But curiosity, as it turns out, had taken root. Will hadn't stopped thinking about the music since Friday. Not just the song, but the silence that followed, the kind that didn't feel empty, but rather expectant. It had left a mark. That morning, from the open glass of his office door, he saw Ellie walking by with a stack of papers balanced against her chest, a pencil behind her ear. Her hair was tied back, a few strands escaping near her temple. She didn't look up. She rarely did. She just kept moving, steady, graceful, intentional. She was, he noticed, the kind of person who filled a room without needing to own it. Throughout the day, He caught glimpses of her speaking softly to the IT intern who was struggling with a software update, quietly helping the facilities manager label boxes for the upcoming relocation, reviewing floor plans for the restoration project without being asked. Not once did she seek recognition. Not once did she speak above what was necessary. He found himself waiting for her piano to return in some form, a humming, a whistle, even tapping fingers. But she didn't do that. Instead, her quiet lived in the way she folded a report, the way she held a pen, the way she listened to people who spoke too fast or too loud. Late that afternoon, Will took the long way back from a meeting on the second floor. He wasn't sure why. Habit, maybe. Or maybe he was just stalling. He passed by the copy room, where he heard two admin staff whispering. She left it again, one said, holding up a small folded piece of paper. She always does that when someone's had a rough day. Will slowed, just out of view. She never signs them, the other replied, unfolding the note. Listen to this one. Still waters hold beauty too. You don't have to make waves to be seen. There was a pause. She's like a little fortune cookie with legs. The first one laughed gently. Will stepped back before they noticed him and continued down the hall. The next morning, he passed by the break room. The space was empty, except for a small notepad on the table and an open box of herbal tea. He reached for the pad. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but the handwriting was elegant, almost old-fashioned, the kind of script that came from someone who still believed in thank-you notes and handwritten lists. Not all silences are empty. Some are waiting for someone brave enough to listen. He read it twice, then folded it once, neatly, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his suit. Will didn't entirely know why. It had no bearing on any business decision. It wasn't a contract, a plan, or a figure. It was something else. That evening, as the building emptied out and the sky outside burned orange and gold, Will returned to his office. He opened the drawer where he kept spare cuff links and company pens. With quiet deliberation, he tucked the note inside, beneath a cufflink box Claire had given him years ago. He closed the drawer gently. Downstairs, Ellie was finishing up. She wiped down a table near the back conference room and turned off the last overhead light. The halls were dim now, filled with the soft echoes of the day winding down. She didn't know he'd seen the note, and he didn't know she'd seen him pause, just briefly, when he passed her desk earlier. They both returned to their own spaces, to their own silences. But something had shifted. It wasn't a spark, not yet. More like the hush before dawn, when light is just beginning to consider rising. Sometimes the quiet ones are the hardest to forget. And Will Ashford, for the first time in years, found himself remembering someone who was still here. He had built his life like a fortress, but some walls don't crack with force. They dissolve with quiet consistency. Will Ashford believed in control. Control kept the company thriving. Control kept the pain at bay. Control, most of all, kept people out. The world saw a man composed, driven, respected. What they didn't see were the invisible walls, the ones built quietly over 6 long years, since the day everything fell apart. So, when the company's marketing director proposed a public launch event for the restored Old Savannah Courthouse, the city's most anticipated heritage project, Will barely looked up from his papers. "We'll pass," he said, without blinking. Across the table, Ellie Monroe sat quietly with a folder in her lap. The marketing team exchanged uneasy glances. "Sir," the director cleared his throat, "the city council has expressed interest in attending. There's media buzz already. This is preservation. We'll cut in, his voice even. Not a circus. Our work speaks for itself." The room fell into a familiar hush. Ellie remained silent, just making notes. She didn't offer her opinion, not yet. But when she glanced up briefly, her eyes met Will's, not confrontational, not submissive, just measured. After the meeting, she was summoned to his office. He stood by the window when she entered, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. "They want you to coordinate this launch," he asked. Ellie nodded. "They said I'm good with logistics." "And are you?" he asked, turning to face her. "I'm good at listening," she replied, "which is where logistics usually fail." He studied her for a beat longer, then looked away. "I don't like showmanship," he muttered. "I've seen too many buildings turned into photo ops. We didn't restore that courthouse for applause." She walked closer, stopping just shy of his desk. "No," she said softly. "You restored it because someone had to remember what it meant." He glanced at her, then a flicker of surprise in his otherwise unreadable expression. "I read the project notes," she added. "The building was moments from demolition. You bought it yourself, kept it off the city's redevelopment list." Will didn't answer right away. He just watched the fading sun slant across the hardwood floor. "I remember standing in that rotunda as a kid," he said at last. "My grandfather brought me there, told me that history doesn't whisper, it waits. It waits for someone to listen." Ellie smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time we gave it a voice again." He returned to his chair and sat down, not offering agreement or refusal. She remained standing. Will folded his hands on the desk. "I've canceled every public event since the memorial. That's not a coincidence." "I know," she said, her tone never shifting. "But I wasn't going to bring that up." Her honesty was startling. Not in what she said, but in how she didn't twist it into pity. "I'm not trying to make this about you," she continued, "or Claire. I'm saying maybe this is bigger than any of us. Maybe the city needs to remember that something can fall apart and still stand again." He looked at her, expression unreadable. "You speak differently than most. I wasn't raised to fill silence," she said simply, "only to honor it." A long pause stretched between them. Then he leaned back slightly. "What would this event look like?" he asked. Ellie's answer came without hesitation. "Modest, no red carpet, just a twilight ceremony, open courtyard, local string quartet, warm cider, soft lights. Let the building speak." Will didn't respond immediately. His eyes drifted to the side drawer of his desk, the one he had opened late the night before, to reread a folded note written in her handwriting. Not all silences are empty. She didn't know he still kept it. He didn't know why he couldn't throw it away. He gave a small sigh. "I'll consider it." Ellie gave a gentle nod. "That's all I ask." She turned to go, but paused at the door. "You don't have to make a speech," she said, voice low but steady. "But I do think you should be there, because part of honoring the past is letting it move forward." Then, after a beat with no agenda, no pressure, she added, "I think you should give history a chance to be continued." And with that, she left. Will remained still, staring at the doorway long after she'd gone. The room felt heavier somehow, but not unpleasantly so. More like how the air feels just before rain, when the sky is deciding whether to cleanse or simply wait. He looked toward the corner where Claire's old bookshelf still stood, untouched since he'd moved offices. A thin layer of dust had gathered on the wood. He exhaled, long and slow. Ellie hadn't tried to convince him. She hadn't pushed. She had simply told the truth. And truth, he was beginning to learn, didn't always knock loudly. Sometimes it just waited gently until you were ready to hear it. It was easier to hide behind history than to be seen in the present, but her voice had found a way through. And for the first time in years, Will Ashford didn't shut the door behind her. Some memories don't need words to return. Just rain. Just music. Just presence. The storm rolled in quicker than anyone expected. The forecast had said light showers, but by the time Will and Ellie reached the outskirts of the suburban site, dark clouds had already swallowed the sky. The old farmhouse they were visiting stood at the edge of a tree-lined road, its white paint peeling, roof sagging, but bones still strong. Ashford and Sons had plans to turn it into a small cultural museum, a quiet tribute to the families who once built the town's foundations. Will insisted on seeing the structure himself before signing off. They had barely begun their walkthrough when the first thunderclap rattled the windows. "We should head back," Ellie said, glancing up at the darkening sky. Will stepped onto the porch, squinting past the trees. The company car was parked nearly a quarter-mile down a gravel road too far to make a dry escape. And then the sky broke. Rain poured down in sheets, hard and fast, soaking the earth within seconds. Will looked back toward the open doorway. "Well, looks like we're staying a while." They retreated inside him first. Ellie trailing behind and settled in the only room that didn't have a leaking ceiling. The walls were bare, the floor creaked with every step, and the windows fogged over from the sudden drop in temperature. There was no furniture, only an overturned crate in the corner and a dusty fireplace that hadn't seen flames in decades. They sat across from each other on opposite sides of the room, listening to the rain drumming against the roof. Ellie took out her notepad, half out of habit, half as something to do. But she didn't write. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Yes, but like an old quilt. Familiar. Intimate in its own quiet way. Will, for once, didn't reach for his phone or his notes. He just sat, his hands folded, eyes tracing the cracked plaster on the far wall. "I brought Claire to a house like this once," he said, his voice soft, almost lost beneath the rhythm of the storm. Ellie looked up but didn't speak. "It was in Vermont," he continued. "We were only a year into marriage. Newlyweds. We'd gotten lost on a drive, stumbled on this rundown cottage. No electricity, no running water, but she insisted we stay." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. She said the quiet would help her think. That night, she found an old upright piano tucked behind a curtain, out of tune, barely playable, but she made it sing. Ellie leaned slightly forward, elbows on her knees, listening. She played Claire de Lune. I remember thinking I'd never heard anything so beautiful. Not just the music her in that moment. No makeup, wet hair, candlelight dancing on her face. He paused. I told myself I'd never forget that night, but for a while, I did. The rain softened, as if giving space to the memory. "I didn't give my grief a chance to breathe," he said quietly. "I packed it into boxes, into spreadsheets, into meetings and deadlines. I thought if I kept moving, it wouldn't catch up." Ellie didn't fill the space with sympathy. She didn't reach out or try to fix what was not hers to mend. She simply said, gently, "It's never too late." Those 4 words floated between them, settling like dust in the golden light bleeding through the clouds. Will exhaled slowly, the weight in his shoulders shifting, not disappearing, but redistributing, like something cracked just enough to let light in. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind rattled a shutter outside. Rain trickled from the edge of the eaves. Eventually, Ellie stood and crossed to one of the windows. She wiped the fog with her sleeve and peered out. "It's easing up," she said softly. "We could probably make it back in 15. Will nodded, but didn't move. When she turned back to face him, he wasn't looking at the window. He was looking at her, not as a colleague, not as an assistant, but as someone who had simply stayed, without expectation, without agenda. For the first time in a long time, someone had stood still with him in the storm, not trying to lead him out, not trying to drag him through, just standing. And something in him, something buried beneath years of silence and stone, acknowledged it. He stood slowly. "Let's take the long way back," he said. She nodded. No questions, no smile, just a quiet understanding. They stepped out into the soft drizzle, the scent of wet leaves rising around them. The farmhouse stood behind them, still weathered, still waiting. But inside, something had shifted, not fixed, not finished, just softened. Grief doesn't vanish, but sometimes, in the company of someone who listens, it remembers how to breathe. And Will Ashford had finally looked up and truly seen someone. There's a line we draw between ourselves and others, not out of pride, but fear of needing someone again. Somewhere between early autumn and the quiet days that followed the rainstorm, Ellie Monroe became more than a temporary assistant. It happened subtly, not through announcements or promotions, but through the way Will began to ask for her by name. Through the way she understood the timing of things, when to step in, when to stay silent, and when to leave the door half open. She wasn't just efficient, she fit. And that, perhaps, was the problem. Because for Will Ashford, a man who had spent years mastering the art of keeping people out, someone fitting into his world wasn't comforting. It was dangerous. One afternoon, during a quiet board meeting, Will stepped out early to take a call. As he closed the door behind him, he didn't hear the hushed voices that followed. "She's around him a lot these days," one of the senior partners murmured. "Smart girl," another said. But too close. Henry Townsend, the oldest member of the board and one of Will's father's closest friends, simply sighed. He lost everything once. He can't afford to get blindsided again. Later that evening, Will returned to his office. The city outside his window was slipping into dusk, and the courthouse project timeline glowed softly on the monitor. He found Ellie's handwriting on a stack of annotated floor plans. Her notes were tidy, thoughtful. Some carried suggestions, others just quiet questions. Beside them, a small, sticky note in her looping hand read "Elevator foyer light flickers. Might unsettle older visitors, suggest softer LED with amber tone." It wasn't in her job description to notice that, or to care. And yet, she did. He stared at the note for a long time, then peeled it off and slipped it into the drawer, closed it, locked it. The next day, he canceled their weekly check-in. No explanation. The day after that, he delegated her usual task of reviewing contracts, giving them instead to a junior associate, who fumbled through them with the grace of a runaway train. By Thursday, he had begun avoiding the break room entirely if he saw her through the glass. And Ellie, for her part, noticed. Of course she noticed, but she didn't press. She didn't knock on his office door or ask what she'd done. She simply did her job, perfectly, silently. There were no more sticky notes, no quiet observations, only distance, not the kind you could measure in steps, but in presence, in the shift of air between two people who had once shared stillness and now shared silence. Friday morning arrived gray and still. The office buzzed faintly, keyboard taps, muted calls, footsteps down the corridor. Ellie sat at her desk with a mug of tea untouched. Her email was open. So was the time-off request form. She stared at the blank fields. Then, slowly, began to type. Reason for leave, personal duration. 3 days. Urgency, none. She paused, then added one final line in handwriting. Sometimes quiet is just another way to wait. She folded the page, walked to Will's office, and slid it onto his desk. He wasn't there. She didn't wait. That afternoon, Will returned from a walk through the restoration site. His shoes were still wet from the damp ground. His collar carried the scent of October wind. He saw the envelope, recognized the handwriting. Inside, the short message and time-off request sat like a stone in his palm. No anger, no drama, no questions, just absence. He set it down slowly and sat at his desk. Outside, a gentle drizzle began to fall, a soft reminder of the last time silence had felt like something other than emptiness. He looked around his office, at the space she had helped organize, streamline, simplify. At the room that, for the first time in years, had felt like something more than just functional. And then he did something he hadn't done in years. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the silence stay. Not as punishment, not as retreat, just as a presence. When someone walks away without slamming the door, the sound they leave behind stays longer. And Will Ashford was listening. Some confessions never reach their destination. But sometimes, being unread doesn't mean they're unheard. The mornings felt different without her. 3 days of absence, and the rhythm of the office had shifted, not drastically, not outwardly, but like a favorite song playing in a different key familiar, yet missing something essential. Will Ashford noticed it in the way the lights felt too bright, in how the silence around his desk wasn't peaceful anymore, but hollow. In the questions no one asked, and the details no one caught. He hadn't replied to Ellie's leave request, hadn't acknowledged it. But the moment she stepped away, he felt the shape of the space she'd filled. That morning, the weather turned again. The sky stretched pale and wide, the kind of light that made everything feel too exposed. Will buried himself in project updates, financial reports, budget forecasts. Numbers had always been safer than people. Predictable, manageable, clean. But when he opened the file marked Materials Expense, September Revision, something caught his eye. A note, not typed, handwritten, in looping cursive. These don't match the vendor invoices I reviewed last week. Look closer. E. He blinked, sat back. Attached to the page was a folder, light blue, no label, just a small paperclip holding a dozen photocopied receipts and internal transfers. Every page was marked carefully, clearly, in red ink. Ellie's handwriting again, neat, precise, no drama, just facts. At the very top of the final page, a single sentence: I don't need you to believe me. But I need you to look. He did. For the next 4 hours, Will combed through line after line. Something inside him shifted from skepticism to tension, then to cold, calculated alarm. The inconsistencies weren't minor. They were deliberate. A series of overcharges, ghost vendors, inflated restoration costs that had been quietly funneled through side accounts, and the signature that authorized many of them, Stephen Lorne, chief financial advisor, Will's college roommate, the man who had stood by his side at Claire's funeral, a man he had known for more than 20 years. The disbelief was like acid. At first, it burned with denial, but the numbers didn't lie. And Ellie had noticed it while on leave. How he didn't know, but why, that was what undid him. Because she could have walked away. She had every reason to, but instead she looked closer. For him, by midnight, the entire folder was spread across his desk. Coffee gone cold beside his elbow. Phone untouched. Lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. He stared at her final note again. Not accusatory, not emotional, just quiet trust. I don't need you to believe me, but I need you to look. He closed his eyes, memory folding back into itself, the way she listened to him in the rain, The way she'd never once asked for praise or recognition. The way she walked away without slamming the door. At 7:03 the next morning, Will walked into the office earlier than he had in months. He carried the folder under his arm, and something in his step had changed. There was urgency, not the panicked kind, but the kind rooted in resolve. He moved straight toward Ellie's desk, expecting, hoping, to see her coat on the chair, her mug warming by the window, her notes half scribbled on the yellow pad. But her desk was empty, too empty. The drawers were closed, the shelves dusted, her notepad gone. He turned to the receptionist. "Where's Ms. Monroe?" The woman glanced up, a little surprised. "She left early, said she just came to collect a few things. Didn't say goodbye." Will stood there, hand tightening slightly around the folder. In all his years leading the company, he had learned to read between lines. And this one was clear Ellie hadn't planned on returning. He returned to his office and sat in silence. Outside the window, Savannah's streets hummed to life soft, slow, like the city was still stretching into the day. He looked down at her file again. Proof of betrayal, of loyalty, of something far more fragile and far more costly. Will had drawn a line between himself and anyone who might matter. Not to protect them, to protect himself. But Ellie, she had never tried to cross it. She had simply stood on the other side, quietly waiting to be seen. And now, she was gone. Sometimes, the loudest cries for connection are the ones never spoken. And the bravest thing you can do is believe in what someone saw in you before you were ready to see it yourself. He realized what hurt more than losing her was letting her walk away without ever saying what she meant. The silence that Ellie left behind wasn't like the ones Will Ashford had grown used to. It didn't soothe. It didn't protect. It echoed. Even after Stephen Lorne had been quietly suspended and a full financial investigation launched. Even after every piece of evidence in Ellie's file had been confirmed down to the decimal. The one question Will couldn't shake wasn't how it happened. It was how he hadn't seen her sooner. How he'd let her carry the truth alone. How he'd let her walk away without stopping her. How he'd mistaken her quiet strength for distance when it had always been grace. 2 days after reading her file, Will found himself standing in the hallway outside the old music room again. It was late. Most of the office had gone home. The building was still, and the only light came from a faded bulb in the corridor. His hand lingered on the doorknob. He hadn't come here since Claire died, until Ellie had unknowingly cracked it open with a single melody. Claire de Lune. And now, the room seemed to pull him in again, not to remember Claire, but to feel something, anything. The piano sat in its usual corner, covered in a thin film of dust. Claire's metronome still stood silently on the edge of the bench, frozen mid-beat. Will sat down. At first, he didn't lift the cover. He just sat, palms flat against his knees, shoulders stiff. Then, with the kind of reverence reserved for ghosts, he pushed back the cover and laid his fingers on the keys. He played, slowly. The notes were hesitant, like old words remembered in fragments. He made it halfway through before something caught in his throat. Not a mistake, not a wrong key, just something real. Memories surfaced too quickly. Claire's laughter, her perfume, the way she'd hum when she thought no one was listening. And then Ellie, not as a replacement, but as someone who stayed long enough to see the man behind the grief. That was when his fingers stopped, not because he couldn't play, but because he didn't want to finish it without her there. He sat in the stillness, The music room felt too full, now not of sound, but of presence. He thought of the note she'd left. "I don't need you to believe me, but I need you to look." He hadn't just looked at the files, he'd looked at himself, and he didn't like what he saw. He'd been so busy hiding behind professionalism and precision, he'd missed the quiet miracle that was Ellie Monroe. She hadn't needed attention or validation. She had simply chosen to see him not the CEO, not the widower, but the man who had forgotten how to feel safe with anyone. And he had let her leave. Will stood, hands clenched lightly at his sides, as if still holding on to something he hadn't said. The air around him felt heavy with unfinished conversations. The melody hung in the air, incomplete, like the apology he'd never given, the thanks he never voiced, the emotion he never admitted. He didn't want to play the ending without her. And maybe he wouldn't have to. The next morning, the sun rose warm over Savannah, streaking gold through the office windows. Will arrived earlier than usual, his steps more certain than they'd been in weeks. Angela, his assistant, looked up from her desk. "Morning, Mr. Ashford." "I need a favor," he said, without preamble. "Of course, I need to know where Eleanor Monroe is." Angela blinked. "Ellie." "Yes." His voice was firm. "I need to find her." There was a pause, but not of confusion, of recognition. Something in Will's face had changed. A tightness had lifted, replaced by clarity. Angela nodded slowly. "Give me a little time. I'll find her." Will exhaled. "Thank you." He returned to his office, but didn't open his laptop. He just sat, staring out the window, listening to the traffic below, the ticking of the antique wall clock, and somewhere, faint in his memory, the unfinished notes of Claire de Lune. Some songs aren't meant to be played alone, and some apologies are meant to be heard even if it takes everything to say them out loud. She didn't expect him to come, and he didn't expect her to say yes. But sometimes we return not because we should, but because we can't help it. It was a Tuesday. The kind of morning when the streets of Savannah looked soft around the edges, light filtering through moss-draped oaks, sidewalks still damp from an early drizzle. The town moved at its usual unhurried pace. Coffee shops hummed, newspapers rustled, nobody rushed. Except Will Ashford. He wasn't dressed in his usual suit, no tie, no briefcase, just a light jacket and a folder tucked beneath one arm, the contents of which had been revised and reprinted 3 times since midnight. He stood outside the small cafe at the corner of Whitaker and Jones, a place Angela said Ellie often visited. It was unremarkable from the outside weathered brick, green awning, chalkboard sign advertising cinnamon scones and live folk music on Fridays. But to Will, it felt like standing at the edge of something fragile. He stepped inside. The bell above the door gave a soft chime. She was there, seated by the window, back to the wall, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. Her hair was tucked behind one ear, and a half-read paperback rested on the table. She looked up, saw him, didn't flinch, didn't smile, either. Just waited. He approached slowly, like someone trying not to spook a wild bird. "Ellie," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Mr. Ashford," she replied, formal, careful. He motioned to the empty seat across from her. "May I?" She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It's your time." He sat. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, thick with things unsaid, and things that didn't need to be said anymore. Will cleared his throat. "I thought you might not want to see me." "I didn't," Ellie said honestly. Then she softened. "But I also didn't want to keep wondering what you might have said if you did come." He nodded, folding his hands on the table. "I don't have a speech," he said. "No apologies drafted, no clever explanations. Good, she said, because I'm not here for that. Will looked at her, then really looked. There was no bitterness in her gaze, just weariness, perhaps, and a kind of quiet hope that flickered at the edges. I failed you, he said finally, not just in how I handled Stephen, but in how I handled you. Ellie tilted her head. You didn't owe me anything. I think I did, Will said, or maybe not in the way you think, but I owed you honesty and presence. You saw more of me than I was willing to admit existed. She didn't respond right away. Outside the window, a street musician played something soft on an old violin. The sound bled into the space between them. I never wanted anything from you. Will, she said, dropping the formality now. I just wanted to know that what I was doing mattered, that I mattered, not as your assistant, not as a problem solver, just as a person. Will nodded. Slowly. I see that now. Ellie looked away for a moment, then back. I don't need a reason, she said, and I don't need you to explain. I just needed you to show up, not for the company, not for the crisis, but for this. He reached for the folder beneath his arm and placed it on the table. It wasn't thick, just a few pages, bound in a soft leather sleeve. What's this? She asked, cautiously. Will pushed it gently toward her. The Morgan House, he said. Our next major restoration project. Late 1800s, abandoned for decades, but structurally intact. Complex work. Needs someone with perspective. She opened the folder. Inside were design sketches, detailed notes, a timeline. At the bottom, her name. But nowhere on the contract did it say secretary. The title read, Project Co-Director. She looked up, startled. This isn't, it is, Will interrupted gently. If you want it, Ellie ran her fingers along the edge of the folder. Why me? He leaned back, exhaling. Because you see things other people miss. Because you understand the weight of what history leaves behind. Because when everyone else looks at broken things and walks away, you stay. And more than that. He paused. You make people want to believe in restoration, not just buildings, but themselves. She closed the folder and, for the first time in days, smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, but real. Will returned it, just barely. So, she said, tapping the folder, co-director, it's the only way I'd do this right. Ellie leaned back in her chair. You still micromanage everything. Only the coffee, he deadpanned. She chuckled, and just like that, something between them thawed. They sat a while longer, not talking, not needing to. Outside, the violin kept playing. Inside, two people sat at a table, surrounded by unfinished conversations and unfinished hopes, no longer afraid to pick them up again. Sometimes, forgiveness doesn't arrive with a grand gesture. Sometimes it walks in quietly, orders coffee, and says nothing at all because nothing needs to be said. Some returns don't come with closure, just a second chance to build something better than before. Some rooms remain closed, not because they're forgotten, but because no one ever dared open them with us. The lobby of Ashford and Sons had never looked quite like this. Usually quiet, filled with the hushed shuffle of architects and preservationists. Today, it hummed with gentle excitement. Soft lights danced across old stone columns. Restored stained glass panels shimmered behind layers of candle glow. Classical music floated from a quartet tucked discreetly to one side. It wasn't a gala. Will had insisted on that. No press, no red carpet, just a quiet, dignified gathering of community leaders, historians, and friends to celebrate the handover of their latest legacy project, the Morgan House. But for Ellie Monroe, standing in the wings in a navy blue dress and heels she rarely wore. It felt like more than that. It felt like walking back into a room that had once been closed to her. A room she never expected would open. Will stood on stage, a simple podium in front of him. He looked calm, even content. But Ellie noticed the way he occasionally pressed his thumb to his palm, a subtle tell she had learned over months of watching. "Nobody restores history alone," Will began, his voice carrying with that signature steadiness. "And some projects don't just ask for skill, they ask for heart." A brief pause. "For years, I believed that preservation was about buildings. Brick, wood, time. But I've come to realize what we're really preserving are the people inside those stories." He looked toward Ellie then. Not rushed, not showy, just a quiet glance, full of something deeper than praise. "Which is why, today, I'm proud to step back and hand forward this company's most personal project, not to an employee, not to a subordinate, but to someone who's helped restore more than walls." He gestured gently. "Eleanor Monroe." Applause rose like warm rain. Ellie stepped forward, calm on the outside, but heart racing with 1,000 quiet memories of rejection, of recognition, of unfinished songs. Will met her halfway. He didn't offer a handshake, just a folder and a nod. As she reached for it, their fingers brushed not by accident. No words were spoken between them on stage, but everyone in the room felt that moment, a handoff not just of responsibility, but of trust. Later, as the event began to wind down, Ellie found herself standing near the old upright piano that had been brought in just for the evening, more decor than instrument, but tuned nonetheless. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For a second, she hesitated, then a single note, then another, then a phrase. Simple, tender, familiar. Claire de Lune. But not the way Claire had played it, and not quite the way Ellie had, either. This time, it was slower, gentler, almost hesitant, like someone walking through an old house, rediscovering a room filled with light. Conversations in the room softened. People turned toward the music, but Will didn't move. He stood by the side archway, hidden from view, watching her, listening, and somewhere deep in his chest, something unlocked. The room he had kept shut for years, the one filled with pain, memory. Music had opened, not violently, not even with courage, but with companionship. Someone had walked in, not to fix it, but simply to stay. After the event, as people trickled out and the quartet packed away their instruments, Ellie moved to the side table where Will waited with 2 glasses of apple cider. "No champagne," he said, handing one to her. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her fingers around the glass. They clinked lightly. "You were wonderful," he added. Ellie glanced away. "I almost didn't play, but you did." She nodded. It felt right. Will was quiet for a moment, then leaned slightly closer. "I have something for you," he said. Ellie raised an eyebrow. "It's not in that folder, is it?" she teased. He smiled a rare, full smile. "No," he said. "It's not work. It's personal." She tilted her head. "Should I be worried? Not unless you hate surprises." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, aged envelope. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. It was Claire's, Will said softly. She wrote this years ago. She was organizing the music room, cataloging family pieces, and she left letters for a few people. This one she labeled "For the one who brings the music back." Ellie stared at the envelope. "I didn't know who it was meant for." Will added, "Until now." Some rooms reopen not with keys, but with trust. And some gifts are passed on, not when we're ready, but when we're finally willing to receive. Not all questions need a loud answer. Some are whispered through music, through memory, through the way someone stays when they don't have to. The Ashford Hall hadn't hosted a concert in nearly 12 years, not since Claire Ashford had passed. But tonight, its chandeliers glowed warm again. The stage had been dusted, the old piano polished until it gleamed. People from the preservation community, local families, and former colleagues filled the room. They came expecting a fundraising recital. What they didn't expect was healing. Ellie stood backstage, dressed in soft gray, simple and elegant. The same violinist from the previous gathering tuned quietly nearby. Everything was in motion, yet she couldn't shake the flutter in her chest. Will had been different lately. Not in a dramatic way, just quieter, more present, less guarded. She had seen it in the way he listened, in the way he stopped correcting small details, in the way he lingered near her after meetings, as if just being nearby mattered. But he'd also been holding something back. And tonight, whatever that was, she sensed it would finally find its way to the surface. The music began, a carefully curated set of classical pieces, each one echoing a part of their shared journey. A cello solo that hummed with longing. A piano and violin duet that unfolded like conversation. Then, near the end, a single spotlight lit the center of the stage. Ellie stepped forward. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She played a new melody, one she had composed quietly over the past few weeks. It had no name, but it was full of all the pauses, hesitations, and gentle restarts that had defined their story. In the final measures, the violin fell to a hush. A single note held just a little longer than expected, like a breath that didn't want to leave. Silence followed, and then applause. But before she could step away, another figure appeared. Will. He walked onto the stage, slowly, in no rush, in no armor, no notes in hand, no speech prepared. He simply looked out at the audience, then turned to Ellie, and spoke. There was a time I believed that silence was safer than sound, that not saying what I felt protected me from grief, from vulnerability, from needing anyone again. He glanced at the crowd, then back to her. But someone walked into my silence, not to fill it, but to understand it. He took a few steps closer. "You didn't fix me," he said gently. "You reminded me I was still worth the effort." A pause, and somewhere between blueprints and music, between arguments and quiet mornings, I found something I thought I'd buried with the past. His voice grew softer. Hope. Ellie's eyes shimmered not from shock, but recognition. Will took a breath, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Gasps rippled through the audience, but neither of them heard it. "Ellie Monroe," he said, voice steady now. "You saw me. The broken parts, the stubborn parts, the parts even I avoided." He opened the box, and you stayed anyway. Then, one final question. "Will you marry me?" The room held its breath. Ellie didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes never left his. And then she nodded, just once, before wrapping her arms around him, resting her head against his chest. The room erupted in applause, but in the quiet space between them, there was no sound, only a heartbeat, and the warmth of two people who had finally decided to stay. Later that night, as the last guests drifted out and the string lights dimmed, Ellie and Will remained on the now empty stage. They sat side by side on the piano bench, hands lightly touching. "You planned all this?" she asked, still a little breathless. Will smiled, only the part where I ask. And if I'd said no, he turned toward her, serious for a moment. I'd still be here. She nodded slowly. So would I. They fell into silence, the good kind. The kind made not of absence, but of presence. Outside, the wind stirred the oak trees. Inside, two hearts sat quietly, no longer waiting for restoration, but already living it. We don't always get to choose who walks into our lives, but we do get to choose who we walk beside and who we stay with. And sometimes, the loudest love stories are the ones whispered in the quiet. Sometimes, the hardest walls to break aren't made of stone, they're made of silence. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes it arrives in a quiet presence, in someone who notices what others overlook, in music that echoes a forgotten feeling, in words that aren't spoken but deeply understood. Will's journey shows us that grief doesn't follow a schedule, and neither does love. We don't move on. We carry. We rebuild, slowly, gently, often with the help of someone who simply stays when they could walk away. And Ellie reminds us that we don't have to be loud to be heard. That kindness, offered without expectation, can be the most powerful act of all. No matter how late in life or how deep the hurt, we are never too far gone for connection, for trust, or for love to find its way back in. So, if you're carrying something heavy today, let this be your reminder. Sometimes, what changes everything is simply choosing to stay. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even in the smallest way, we'd be so grateful if you gave it a like, shared it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel for more gentle stories that speak to the soul. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Until next time, take care and keep a little kindness close.